Roll 'em. Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, the co-host. And Daniel, good to see you this morning.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, very good. Yesterday there was a referendum vote. The Dutch had a vote dealing with the Ukraine and whether or not the Netherlands should have a close association with Ukraine. They needed 300,000 signatures for this referendum. I guess when they were permitted to do this, they figured nobody would ever get 300,000, which means that the Dutch people wanted to speak out on this. What they're speaking out on is whether the EU treaty that is proposed is in the benefit of the Dutch. And the vote was pretty surprising for a lot of people. It made a lot of news, even though it didn't crack the news cycle here, because the only thing that is worth talking about in this country is which person is going to be the next president. And sometimes I put that lower down on the ladder because I don't have a whole lot of hope that much will change. But this is an important issue, and I glanced at the TV stations just to see if they reported it. I didn't happen to see anything on that, but of course the internet will have this. But the vote came up yesterday. It wasn't a huge turnout. It was 30-some% turned out, but they had to get over a certain level, because if they hadn't gotten over this 30% or something, it was not an authentic referendum. But they met the threshold. But the big surprise was over 60%, I think it was 61% of the people that voted, were motivated to come out, said, no way, we don't want to have this deal with Ukraine. But what I find is interesting is that we talked about Ukraine a couple years ago, and a lot since. But the big deal 2 years ago was the fact that there was an argument about the same subject with the Ukrainian people. And they had an elected leader, Yanukovych, and he leaned east. But the United States didn't like that. The United States was supporting somebody else, and Poroshenko. So there was some orchestration, and there was an overthrow, and I think it's legitimate called a coup. And all of a sudden, Yanukovych had to leave. And that had to do with which way the Ukrainians would go, east or west, with NATO and the European Union, or have closer friendship with the Russians. I don't know why you can't have a choice of saying, why don't we be friends with everybody? But anyway, this battle went on. But now, the European Union, it's fragile. There are things that are fragile. But they had this vote, and the markets made the markets a little bit nervous today. So I think it's a big deal, because it's related to migration. It's related to our foreign policy of why is there so much migration? Why are the Europeans now changing their tune? And do you think that this could be the beginning of the end, or the middle of the beginning of the end of the European Union?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, all of the other parliaments in the EU ratified it without going to the vote of the people. Just the parliaments ratified, so it was a technicality. But there was a law passed in the Netherlands in 2014 that allowed for, as you mentioned, popular referenda on major issues if enough signatures were gained. Nobody expected the people that supported the idea of referendum to put this to a referendum. It was expected to just be rubber stamped by the Dutch Parliament. And so it was a big surprise, but it's interesting because it underscores I think it's charitable to call it ambivalent, but the negative view toward democracy in Brussels. But the Dutch people went to the streets, they voted, not in huge numbers, but in enough to make it legitimate, and as you say, overwhelmingly rejected the treaty. I think there are a number of reasons why they did, and we can get into those as we discuss it, but it is extraordinarily significant. The European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, is said to be very sad right now and very depressed. People are not supposed to be allowed to vote on these kinds of things because, after all, it's only a few $1 billion that it'll cost them.
Well, I think it's Juncker that had that famous quote when it was the Greek crisis, that when it becomes serious, you have to lie. Yeah. So he at least is more upfront about lying. I mean, we get lied to all the time, but oh no, governments would never lie to the American people. They might have bad information, but they never tell lies. But our friend Nigel Farage was in the Netherlands, and he was participating in this debate to a degree, and I'll bet he's feeling pretty good today because he's been working hard to get somewhat similar vote and an even more powerful vote, I think, coming up in June 23rd of this year. He finally got that on the ballot, that there will be a vote, and that could be a significant vote and change the whole texture of the European Union.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a shot in the arm for the Brexit move, they call it, for Britain to exit the EU. And what's interesting about the Brexit campaign, the yes to leave the EU, is that it's a broad coalition from Nigel Farage on what's considered the right, the populist right, to George Galloway on the populist left, to even someone like Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, who is considered a pretty mainstream, if slightly eccentric, member of the British conservative establishment. So you have a broad movement against Britain being in the EU, and this kind of referenda has not only given a shot in the arm to that, which will take place on June 23rd, but also will give a shot in the arm to Eurosceptics across the region. And in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders has always been slightly marginal figure, very anti-immigration, but this certainly propels him to a position of higher authority. But also, if you look eastward, people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and others who are pushing for more sovereignty within the EU are obviously, I think, going to get a shot in the arm from this.
It's similar in ways when the debate occurred here over NAFTA, free trade versus protectionism. And the free traders, the so-called free traders, are for treaties like this, and they were for NAFTA, which we could lower tariffs, which on the surface, I like trade and I like low tariffs, but I was never for these treaties because it was government, and it really wasn't free trade. It was managed trade to protect certain special interests, and they more or less managed, right now there's been some managing of tariffs dealing with China, on some product. So they give permission to manage trade. And this is what this is all about. And there's really nobody, the issue of true free trade isn't even in this. It's either, is it going to be the managed trade with this new treaty and under the European Union, or are we going to have those who are fearful of what's happening? And they have a lot of reason to be fearful with the migration that's going into Europe, which we significantly contributed to, and that they are more the strong protectionists, and they have their special reasons why we don't want to deal with certain groups of people, but really they don't talk about the benefits of having an integrated Europe or an integrated Western Hemisphere, which is voluntary, which is market-oriented, and let people make their own decision. Let people spend their money the way they want and get the politicians out of it. And that's what's always so sad to me is most people don't even know there is another option. You either have to have strong protectionism. What's going on in our presidential campaign is, are we going to put on tariffs and restrain trade as a solution, or are we going to have another government agency do it? But then nobody says, hey, why don't we try free trade, true free trade?
Well, this goes to the heart of the establishment of the European idea. The idea would have been to break down barriers between the countries of Europe, to strip things down in terms of trade, of tariffs and things. But what they did instead is build a superstructure above it, a new layer of bureaucracy that was less accountable to the population. So instead of stripping it bare, they added on top of it and regulated it from on top. But the interesting thing, you talk about the free trade aspect of the treaty with Ukraine, but this goes back to what we talked about earlier a couple of days ago. It's the interventionism that has made the whole idea of trade with Ukraine absurd, because the interventionism to overthrow the government in Ukraine has produced a situation where the Ukrainian government, first of all, is completely bankrupt. The industry is completely destroyed because it was 100% dependent on trade with Russia. So we destroyed those traditional relationships. There's absolutely nothing the Ukrainians make that the Europeans want to buy. And not even agriculture, which is so heavily protected in Western Europe that there's no way you dare even buy a carrot from Kiev. Yeah, you'll have the farmers in an uproar. So the interventionist has destroyed the whole concept of trade at all with Ukraine.
Sometimes you really have to wonder, are they idiots? Do they not believe in this? Or are they doing this on purpose or whatever? But there are so many unintended bad consequences of this policy. One other unintended consequence from this that might come that they postulate is maybe the Prime Minister, whatever he is, of Netherlands might have to resign over this. His government might fall of this, which shouldn't hurt anything. Maybe the people should be hurt. And I think that point that you point, that there were no votes by the people on this in the other countries, that all the politicians pushing it through. So they talk about democracy, and we participate. But we're part at fault of this, especially with the Ukrainian episode. But that's not even in the good sense of, if you can find something in democracy in a democratic election. It's all this rigging and stuff. I wonder where our CIA is. I guess they were caught short-handed on this referendum.
Well, close enough. George Soros, who seems to always do the bidding of the CIA, he was the major financier of the yes vote. And that may have actually irritated a lot of Dutch voters. They may have turned against that, this outside influence in the election process. But here's a funny story about Jean-Claude Juncker. He is an unelected president of the European Commission. And he once greeted Viktor Orban, who is the elected prime minister of Hungary, by saying, "Hello, dictator." So that says the mentality. But it says something else about what they've always called the democratic deficit in Brussels. The European structure has such a deficit of democracy, and that raises the question that I was thinking about, what comes next? Because in 2005, there was a proposal for a European constitution to supersede the existing legal structures of the European Union. The Dutch went to a referendum then, as did other countries, and they voted against it overwhelmingly. So did the French, by the way. Voted against it, so they put that off the table, and Brussels wasn't discouraged. They said, we need a period of reflection. So they basically waited another year and said, we're going to do the same thing by a different method. They simply rejiggered the existing treaties to reflect the real spirit of the Constitution itself and had that put into place. So there's a whole history of the European Union ignoring the will of the people. The question I would have is, after this vote, will they just simply ignore it and continue on in a different way?
Maybe Obama knew what was coming. Let's pivot away from Europe. Of course, they don't really do that. Let's go distract the people. Let's go to Asia. But this is a mess. It involves a foreign policy, and Europe is going to get in more chaos every single day because of economic conditions. You point out specifics on how things were made worse with Ukraine, but all of Europe is, over-socialized, and welfare programs are all bankrupt. They're closer to being like Greece than anybody else. At the same time, they have this insane policy that they have this moral obligation for the people of Europe to be taxed, to finance migrants who are suffering from the consequence of the European-American wars. Now, I'm for allowing people to move around as much as possible, but I can't stand the idea that people can come in and be dictated and say that they come in and be forced in and then make the people forced to pay for it. Yeah. And that causes hostility. It's a hostility in this country, and I think our economic problems here are potentially worse than every place, but they're not as bad on the surface as the Europeans. So you have the fallacy in the economic policy, and you have the consequences of a ridiculous foreign policy, and then they get combined, and they go in and they cut off the trade, put a new guy in, cut off the trade with the Russians, and put more poverty in Ukraine. Say, well, maybe if they were part of the European Union and they'll need protection against the Russians are going to invade. So therefore, we'll put them in NATO and the European Union, and everything is going to be okay. But guess what? Inevitably, that type of mischief leads to more problems, and we are seeing the consequences of it. And also, that's the reason on the short run I'm pessimistic. They're not going to wake up and do the right thing, because they're determined in economics or foreign policy to continue to do what has been wrong and harmful for 30, 40 years. They got away with it, but eventually they can't get away with it, and that's what we're approaching.
I think it's interesting something you said earlier. You started out by saying you think this is a big deal, and I think it is too, and a lot of people do, almost not covered in the media.
Right.
The same with our economic crisis. You said you think it's a big deal, but it's not really covered in the media. It's not really approached. So it's interesting how the media ignores both of these events, but then when something big happens, they'll say, wow, we never saw this coming.
I wonder how many presidential candidates today will be asked about the details of what's going on with a referendum in the Netherlands and over the European Union. It's not going to happen. They're not going to deal with that. But you can find a few items in the news dealing with something of total unimportance in the presidential campaigns of wives being dragged into it and name calling and all this. It is really deteriorated, I think, and I think dangerous in the sense that they're ignoring the problem. But the American people are upset. They sense there's something wrong, and yet they seem to drift toward the loudest voice, saying, yes, there is a problem and we're going to take care of your problem, but they're still not dealing with the problem, and they're not dealing with a serious change in the foreign policy, and they're not about to repeal Keynesianism, because that means people who can't pay their bills would go bankrupt, and that's intolerable. It's best to wait until we destroy the currency. So that is what we're facing. We have a bankrupt foreign policy and a banked up economic policy too, and I don't see an easy way out.
Well, it's like you say, the people have a sense that something's wrong, but because the media never covers these issues in a complete way, they have no idea what exactly it is. So then they're drawn to the dumbed down circus atmosphere because they don't really know these other issues.
Well, let's hope that all changes. We do our very best to expose the people to what's really going on and think a little bit differently about these issues. But of course, the goals are a little bit different for us. We're seeking peace and prosperity, and we're seeking voluntarism. We're seeking sound money. And they're not very popular because somebody has to, pay the bills. And they're looking around for the victims who have to pay the bills. During the campaign, a lot of people say, well, to do what you want to do, people are going to have to sacrifice. And I said, why should people have to sacrifice? If we return liberty to the people and sound money and free markets, civil liberties, a foreign policy where we're not starting wars, people aren't going to suffer. The only people that would suffer on a return or a move toward, a freer society are the people who are living off other people, and they don't deserve to be taken care of, and that's what's been going on for a long time. So hopefully the American people will pay attention, get their news from other places than the news stations, and dealing with superficial things that are going on in this country and around the world. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.